New York, Harlem. After the death of the man who once saved a young Bumpy Johnson's life, his ambitious grandson begins taking Bumpy's influence in Harlem piece by piece, unaware that an old oath prevents Johnson from responding the way he normally would. But the conflict quickly reaches Bumpy's family, forcing him to make an impossible choice: his family or his oath. Subscribe now if you're interested in the legends of notorious crime bosses and the lives they led. Get comfortable. We're about to begin. 9:14. Harlem buries its old men on cold mornings. Nobody plans it that way. It just happens, the way weather happens to people who don't own umbrellas. Bumpy Johnson stood outside Ebenezer Funeral Home in a black overcoat, hat in his hands instead of on his head, watching mourners file past a hearse that had seen better decades. He didn't go in yet. Some rooms need a man to finish deciding what he's walking into before he walks into it. Cyrus Dubois was dead. 81 years old, a bad heart, a good bed to die in. That was more mercy than most men in this life were given, and Bumpy knew it better than most. 9:20. A woman in a gray coat touched his sleeve on her way past, an old neighbor from the days when Cyrus still ran the press himself. "You knew him from the shop," she said. Not a question. A memory, looking for confirmation. A long time ago. "He talked about you. Once. Said there was a young man he'd helped who turned into something the neighborhood would either thank him for or curse him over, and he never could decide which." Bumpy didn't answer that. Some men leave behind more truth in a stranger's half-remembered sentence than in anything written on their headstone. 9:23. Inside, the room smelled of lilies and shoe polish, the particular smell of respect, performed by people who couldn't always afford it. Bumpy signed the book. Small, careful letters. He looked up and found a young man watching him from across the room. Mid-20s, sharp suit, sharper eyes, standing near the casket, like he had every right to be closest to it. He did have that right. Blood gave it to him. Bumpy didn't know his face yet, only the shape of it. Cyrus's jaw, somebody else's coldness behind the eyes. A grandson does not inherit a man's face by accident. He inherits it because the world insists on repeating itself. 9:31. "Eli," the young man said, extending a hand Bumpy hadn't asked for. "Eli Dubois. You knew my grandfather." "I did? He never talked about you." "That was true, and it should have stung less than it did. Some men keep their debts the way other men keep their money, quiet, uncounted, never spent in front of company." "He wasn't a man who talked about much," Bumpy said. Eli's smile didn't reach anywhere useful. "No, he wasn't." A pause, measured, deliberate. "Funny. My whole life, and I never once heard your name in his house. And here you are, first in line to sign the book. A debt paid in silence still gets paid. It just doesn't announce itself at dinner." 9:37. "You run something downtown now, I hear," Bumpy said, mostly to see what the boy would do with an open door. "A few things. Growing." Eli's eyes moved over Bumpy's coat, his shoes, the particular economy of a man pricing another man without being asked to. "You still run what you've always run, I hear. Or most of it, anyway. Some say less than you used to." "Some say a lot of things." "They do." Eli's smile came back, thinner this time. "I'd like to sit down sometime. man to man. Understand the map a little better before I go coloring inside somebody else's lines by accident. Come by whenever you're ready to sit still long enough to listen." Eli laughed, short, without much humor in it, and moved off toward the casket. A polite conversation on its surface. Underneath it, two men had just measured each other for the first time, and both had come away with numbers they didn't like. 9:44. Bumpy sat 3 rows back during the service, close enough to watch, far enough to think. The preacher spoke about a life of quiet service, a man who ran a small print shop on 131st for 40 years, raised 2 daughters alone after his wife passed young. None of it mentioned a printing press that ran more than church bulletins after midnight. None of it mentioned a revolver kept under a counter, or an alley, or a night neither Bumpy nor Cyrus had ever spoken of to another living soul. The dead keep some rooms locked, even in eulogy. Bumpy kept his eyes on Eli the whole service. A man's grief tells you less about him than the stillness underneath it. Eli's stillness had teeth. 9:58. Beside Eli in the family pew sat a man Bumpy hadn't noticed at first. Older than Eli by 5 years or so, broader through the shoulders, watching the room the way a bodyguard watches a room instead of the way a mourner watches a coffin. Ezra Pratt. Bumpy didn't know the name yet. He would. What he noticed, without yet understanding its weight, was the way Ezra's hand rested once, briefly, on Eli's shoulder during the eulogy. Not comfort exactly. Something closer to ownership. The gesture of a man reminding another man, silently, in a room full of witnesses, whose steadiness was actually holding the two of them upright. Small things were often the only things that told the truth. 10:02. The flashback came uninvited, the way old debts do, arriving exactly when a man least wants to count them. 1928. 19 years old. A different Harlem. Hungrier. Meaner. Before Bumpy Johnson meant anything to anybody. He'd been running a package through blocks that weren't his to run through. 3 streets of territory belonging to men who didn't forgive trespass, whatever the reason for it. They caught him in an alley, off 131 Street. No wider than a hallway. Brick walls, close enough on both sides to touch. 3 of them. One with a knife already drawn, already comfortable in his hand. The comfort of a man who'd used it before and expected to again. Bumpy had nothing. No gun, no blade, no room to run. The alley didn't care what a young man deserved. It only offered what it had, which was nothing. 10:07. He remembered even now the particular smell of that alley. Wet brick, garbage 2 days uncollected, the faint sweetness of something rotting behind a restaurant's back door. He remembered thinking, with the strange clarity fear sometimes grants a man right before it takes everything else away, that this was a stupid place to die. Not a dramatic place. Not a place that would mean anything to anyone. Just an alley, the kind a city has 10,000 of, indifferent to which one happened to end a life that night. The man with the knife had smiled before he moved, the particular smile of someone who has already decided the outcome and is only waiting to enjoy arriving at it. 10:11. A side door had opened. Not dramatic. Not slow motion the way memory likes to lie about these things. Just a door, and a man in an ink-stained apron standing in it, holding a revolver so old it looked more like a museum piece than a weapon. "That's enough," the man had said. not loud. Loud men lose rooms before they open their mouths. The three hadn't run immediately. Men rarely do, the first time somebody tells them the party's over. The old man fired once into the brick above their heads, dust raining down like a small, ugly snow. That did it. They ran. One of them, the one with the knife, swung wide on his way past, not at Bumpy anymore, at the old man who'd cost him his evening. The blade opened his forearm to the bone. 10:15. Bumpy remembered the sound more than the sight. Not a scream, just a short, sharp intake of breath. The sound of a man absorbing pain the way he'd probably absorbed every other hardship life had handed him, privately, without spending more of it than necessary on anyone watching. Blood had run fast down the old man's wrist, dripping off his fingers onto the cobblestones, and still he hadn't lowered the revolver until the alley was empty and quiet enough to trust. Only then had he looked at his own arm, almost with mild surprise, the way a man looks at a bill arriving slightly higher than expected. "Well," he'd said, "that's going to need attention." 10:19. The old man hadn't screamed. He'd looked down at his own arm the way a man looks at a bill he suspected was coming. "Inside," he'd said, "before you draw a bigger crowd standing there looking useless." The back room of the print shop smelled like ink and kerosene, shelves of type blocks and stacked paper, a press in the corner that did more work after dark than during business hours, though Bumpy hadn't understood that yet. Not fully. The old man sat on a stool, held his arm out, and said, calm as a man ordering coffee, "You know how to sew?" "No." "Then tonight you learn. I'm not going to a hospital over 3 fools with a knife." 10:23. "Why not a hospital?" Bumpy had asked, hands already reaching for the needle the old man had produced from a tin box. The same tin box, Bumpy would understand years later, that he himself would eventually keep. Hospitals ask questions. Questions get written down. Written down things have a way of finding their way to people I'd rather not think about me at all. What kind of people? The kind that don't matter to you yet. Might someday, if you keep running packages through streets that don't belong to you. A faint, pained smile. Thread. Through the eye. Slow. Bumpy's hands had shaken so badly, the first attempt missed the needle's eye by half an inch. 10:27. His hands had shaken the whole time. Needle. Thread pulled from a spool meant for canvas, not skin. A lamp turned up as bright as it would go. The old man talked him through it without flinching once, voice steady, even as the needle went in, even as blood ran down onto a stack of church bulletins that would never be delivered now, ruined by a debt that had nothing to do with the church. "Why?" Bumpy had finally asked, hands still trembling around the last stitch. "You don't know me. Why open that door?" The old man had studied him a long moment, the kind of look that measures a person and doesn't announce the sum out loud. "Because somebody has to," he'd said, and tonight it was standing closest. 10:31. "That's it? That's the whole reason?" "Most good reasons are small ones, dressed up big after the fact, by people who need them to mean more than they did in the moment." The old man flexed his bandaged arm, testing the stitches with the mild curiosity of a craftsman checking his own work, even though the work had been Bumpy's hands, not his. "Not bad, crooked, but it'll hold." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be useful. Sorry doesn't sew anything shut. It was, Bumpy would think decades later, the truest sentence anyone had ever handed him for free. 10:35. That should have been the end of it. A stranger's kindness, repaid in gratitude, forgotten the way most kindness eventually is, worn smooth by years and other debts stacked on top of it. It wasn't the end. Bumpy had come back the next week with money he didn't have to spare, and the old man had refused it flatly, offended almost, like the offer itself cheapened what had happened. "I don't want your money," he'd said. "Money's not what almost got spent in that alley." "Then what do you want?" The old man had looked at his own bandaged arm, the wound already starting its slow work toward a scar that would sit there the rest of his life, a permanent ledger entry. "Nothing for me," he'd said. "But I've got daughters. Someday, maybe grandchildren I won't live to meet properly. Promise me something instead of money." 10:40 Bumpy had waited, understanding somehow already, before the sentence finished, that whatever came next would cost him more than the money he'd offered and been refused. "Name it." "Sit down first. A promise made standing up is a promise a man takes less seriously than one made sitting still, looking somebody in the eye while he says it." Bumpy had sat on an overturned crate across from a man twice his age, with a bandaged arm and eyes that had already seen enough of the world to know exactly what he was asking for, and exactly what it would eventually cost the both of them. 10:44. "Whatever happens between you and this city," Cyrus had said, "whatever you become, good or bad, my family stays out of it. Not touched, not used, not owed anything by you, and never owing anything to you either. Just untouched, like they don't exist in whatever ledger you keep." Bumpy had been 19, bleeding gratitude out of every pore, in no position to weigh what a promise like that might someday cost a man who didn't yet know what he'd become. "I swear it," he'd said, and meant it the way only a 19-year-old can mean something, completely, without understanding yet what completeness required. Some promises are cheap the day you make them. They get expensive later, the way all real debts do, slowly, then all at once, decades after the ink dried on a man's intentions. 10:48. "Say it again," Cyrus had said. "Slower. I want to hear you mean it, not just say it." Bumpy had repeated it, word by word, watching the old man's face for whatever satisfaction or doubt might cross it. Neither came. Only a kind of tired relief, the relief of a man setting down a weight he hadn't known he was carrying until somebody offered to help hold it. "Good," Cyrus had said. "Now go home, and don't come back here unless you need something sewn, or you're buying paper honestly. I've got a press to run, and you've got a life to decide what kind of man is going to be living it." That had been the last real conversation the two of them ever had. Everything after was nods on the street, a shop that stayed open, a debt that stayed quiet. 30 years folding themselves down into a single kept promise neither man ever needed to mention again. 10:53. Back in the present, the service ended, and Bumpy stood at the edge of the burial with his hat finally on, watching Eli Dubois shake hands with mourners, like a man already calculating which ones might be useful to him later. Grief and ambition rarely arrive in the same body honestly. Sometimes they do anyway. Eli caught his eye across the grave, held it a beat longer than courtesy required. "Not hostile? Not yet?" just aware. The particular awareness of a young man cataloging every older man in the room as either an obstacle or a tool, deciding later which one Bumpy Johnson would turn out to be. Bumpy left before the dirt started falling. A promise doesn't need witnesses to still be binding. 11:04. He walked, rather than drove, the 6 blocks from the cemetery gate to where his car waited, needing the time more than the exercise. Harlem moved around him the way it always moved, indifferent to whichever of its sons had just gone into the ground. A fruit cart, a stoop full of children, a radio somewhere, playing something slow enough to match his mood without meaning to. He passed the corner of 131st without planning to, and found himself standing in front of what had once been Cyrus's print shop, now a shuttered storefront with a faded sign nobody had bothered to take down, glass painted over from the inside, the particular abandonment of a building whose purpose had died before its walls did. He stood there longer than he meant to. 11:12. The window still bore, faintly, beneath 30 years of grime and old paint, the outline of letters that had once spelled Dubois Printing, the D nearly gone entirely, worn away by weather and neglect. Bumpy pressed a hand flat against the glass, cold under his palm, and thought about a needle, and a lamp turned up bright, and a promise made on an overturned crate by a man who'd asked for almost nothing in return, for very nearly dying on his behalf. He thought, too, about the boy at the funeral, the sharp suit, the sharper eyes, measuring him like a set of numbers on a ledger. Blood carries a man's face forward. It doesn't always carry his character with it. 11:20. 3 weeks later, the first hit came, quiet enough that most of Harlem never noticed it happened at all. The Palm Room, a bar Bumpy had owned outright for 6 years. Steady money, steady crowd, lost its liquor delivery overnight to a new supplier offering terms nobody legitimate could match. Theo Marsh brought him the news over breakfast, laid it out flat, the way a man lays out a hand. He already knows, has lost. Somebody's undercutting us on the Palm Room's liquor. Word is it traces back to Dubois. Which Dubois? The grandson, Eli. Moved fast, moved quiet. 3 weeks since the funeral, and he's already got a supplier working under us. Bumpy set down his coffee. Let it go. Theo blinked. Let it go. 11:26. You want to explain that? Theo said. Or am I supposed to just take it on faith the way Wesley's been taking everything on faith since the funeral? I don't owe you an explanation for every decision I make. No, Theo agreed. But you've never once made a decision like this in 12 years of me watching you make them. So forgive me for wanting to understand the new math. Bumpy studied him a moment. Theo had earned honesty, if not the whole shape of it. Some debts don't show up on a ledger you can read, he said. Trust that this one's real, even if I can't hand you the paper on it yet. 11:31. He's testing, Bumpy said, before Theo could argue it. One bar, one supplier. That's not a war. That's a knock on a door to see who answers. So we don't answer. We don't answer loud. Theo studied him a long moment, the way men who've worked for someone a long time study a decision they don't yet understand. You're letting a kid take a piece off your board and calling it strategy. I'm letting a kid think he took a piece, Bumpy said. There's a difference, even if it doesn't look like one from where you're standing. It didn't feel like a lie. It also didn't feel entirely like the truth. A promise doesn't leave room for strategy. It only leaves room for restraint dressed up as one. 11:40. That afternoon, Bumpy drove past the palm room himself, slow, unremarkable, just another car on a street full of them. Through the window, he could see the new delivery truck idling out front, men he didn't recognize unloading crates with the easy confidence of people who believed they'd already won something. He didn't stop. A king who checks every lost inch of ground with his own eyes teaches his enemies exactly how much that ground still costs him. Better to let the boy believe the silence meant nothing at all. Silence here isn't the absence of sound. It's a command, even when the man giving it hasn't decided yet what he's commanding toward. 11:47. Wesley Cade heard about it by noon, the way everything eventually reached Wesley, through channels nobody could ever quite trace back to their source. Wesley ran security the way other men ran a church, with discipline, with rules, with an unshakable belief that the rules existed for good reason and ought to be enforced, without exception. The palm room, he said, finding Bumpy in the office that afternoon. That's not nothing. I know what it is. Then why aren't we doing anything about it? Bumpy looked at him a long moment, weighing how much truth a man like Wesley could carry, without needing the whole shape of it explained. Because not everything that looks like weakness is weakness, he said. Some of it's just patience, wearing weakness as a coat. Wesley didn't look convinced. He didn't argue either. Not yet. 12:03. The second hit came 10 days later, and this one wasn't quiet at all. Nathaniel Cross, one of Bumpy's collectors, a soft-spoken man with 6 kids and a bad knee, got pulled off a corner near 135th by 3 of Eli's men in broad daylight. They didn't rob him. They made him kneel on the sidewalk in front of a barber shop full of witnesses and told him to deliver a message with his forehead pressed against the concrete. Tell your boss the street's changing hands, 1 block at a time, and there's nothing old about being smart enough to notice. Nate came back, shaking, more from humiliation than fear, the particular shame of a grown man made small in front of neighbors who'd known him 20 years. They didn't touch a hair on him, Wesley reported, jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. Just made him kneel, in front of everybody. Bumpy said nothing for a long moment. Some silences cost more than words ever could. 12:09, he asked to see Nate himself, later that evening, and found the older man sitting alone in the back of the barber shop where it happened, the chairs empty, the mirrors reflecting nothing but a single low bulb, and a man trying to reassemble whatever dignity 3 strangers had spent an afternoon taking apart in front of people he'd fed and buried and baptized alongside for 2 decades. I should have fought, Nate said, not looking up, against 3 men in a barber shop, with your knee the way it is. You'd have died for nothing, and I'd still be sitting here having this conversation, except now it'd be about your funeral instead of your face. Feels the same either way tonight. Bumpy sat down across from him. It's not the same. You're alive. That's not nothing. Don't let them convince you it is. 12:15. That's not testing anymore, Wesley said, later, back at the office. That's a message. And you're going to sit on your hands while a boy who's been in the game 3 months makes your own people kneel in the street? I heard you the first time. Then say something. Give me a name and a night, and I'll handle it clean. Nobody has to know it came from you." Bumpy stood, walked to the window, looked down at a street that had absorbed worse than one man's knees against concrete, and would absorb worse again before the century finished with it. "Not yet." "When?" "When I say." It wasn't an answer. Wesley knew it wasn't an answer. He left the office anyway, because 20 years of following orders had taught him that a closed door sometimes said more than an open mouth ever would. 12:29 alone, Bumpy allowed himself a version of the truth he hadn't shown Wesley. He'd seen Eli's face in that alley 30 years ago or something close enough to it. Cyrus's jaw on a younger frame. Cyrus's stillness sharpened into something colder by a generation that hadn't needed to bleed to survive the way its fathers had. He owed that face nothing. He owed the man who'd raised it, buried now under 6 weeks of fresh dirt. A promise that didn't come with an expiration date, didn't come with fine print excusing him the moment the promise became inconvenient. A debt paid in blood outlives the men who signed it. He'd signed his in an alley with a needle and thread and a stranger's steady voice talking him through it. He intended to keep paying it, whatever the interest turned out to cost him. 12:41. Across town, in a back office above a garment shop that had once belonged to somebody else, and now belonged, on paper at least, to a company with Eli's initials buried 3 layers deep in its filing. Ezra Pratt counted the week's numbers and didn't like what the arithmetic told him. "The bar's turning a profit. The corner sends a message." "But he still hasn't answered any of it," Ezra said, setting the ledger down harder than it needed to be set. "Every week he doesn't answer. It costs us something we can't get back. Momentum's a currency too, Eli. You spend it standing still just as fast as you spend it moving wrong." Eli didn't look up from the window. "He's not standing still. He's deciding." "Deciding what?" "I don't know yet. That's what worries me." 12:52. Odessa found him that evening exactly the way she always found him. Not by searching, just by existing in the same rooms, long enough that eventually their paths crossed without either of them trying. "You've been somewhere else all week," she said, not a question. "Old business." "The Dubois boy." He looked at her, surprised, though he shouldn't have been. Little in that house moved without Odessa eventually knowing its shape. "Cyrus's grandson," he confirmed. "You knew Cyrus." "A long time ago." She didn't press further, which was its own kind of grace, the specific grace of a marriage built on knowing which locked rooms deserved to stay locked, at least until their owner decided otherwise. "Whatever it is," she said, "don't let it cost you more than it's worth." He didn't tell her that some costs get decided the day a promise is made, not the day it comes due. 13:02. "Adele asked about you today," Odessa said, setting a cup of tea in front of him he hadn't asked for and would probably let go cold. "Said you've been quiet at dinner. Said you look like a man carrying something he won't put down long enough to let anyone help him carry it. She notices too much. She's your daughter. Noticing too much runs in the family." He almost smiled at that, the first almost smile the week had offered him. "Tell her I'm fine." "I will. She won't believe it any more than I do." Odessa touched his shoulder on her way past, brief, familiar, the particular touch of 2 decades of marriage that no longer needed more than that to say what needed saying. 13:10. The third hit landed a week after that, And this one was aimed somewhere Bumpy hadn't expected. Not at a bar, not at a collector, but at a license. The Silver Suds Laundromat on Lenox, a legitimate business Bumpy had run clean for a decade, specifically because clean businesses gave a man cover other kinds couldn't, lost its water permit overnight to a bureaucratic technicality nobody had enforced in years. Somebody had made a call. Somebody had greased the exact palm that needed greasing to make an old, ignored rule suddenly matter again. Theo brought the paperwork in, laid it on the desk without a word this time, letting the document speak for itself. Paper is colder than steel. It also sometimes cuts just as deep, and this cut had Eli Dubois' fingerprints all over it, even without a single one actually appearing anywhere on the page. 1317. He's not just muscle, Theo said. He's got somebody downtown, somebody with a stamp and a reason to use it. Find out who. And when I do? Nothing. Not yet. Just find out. Theo hesitated at the door. The same hesitation Wesley had shown days earlier. The shape of men who'd followed Bumpy Johnson's instincts for years, suddenly finding those instincts unrecognizable. Boss, I've worked for you 12 years. I've never once seen you take 3 hits without answering one. Then you're about to learn something new about patience, or about to watch you lose something you can't get back by waiting too long to move. The door closed behind him before Bumpy could decide which version of that sentence was closer to true. 1329. He drove out to the laundromat himself that afternoon, stood outside the padlocked door reading a city notice stapled crooked to the frame, the particular crookedness of a document filed in haste by someone who hadn't expected anyone important to actually come read it in person. A woman who worked the counter recognized him, came out from next door, where she'd been waiting for the machines to reopen, worry written plain across her face. Mr. Johnson, they said it's temporary. Is it temporary? It's temporary, he said, and meant to make it true before the week was out. Whatever else remained undecided. She thanked him and went back to waiting. The particular patience of people who had learned, over years in this neighborhood, that things eventually got fixed by somebody, even when the fixing took longer than anyone liked. 1338. That night, back at the office, Isaac Bell, a young runner who'd been with the operation barely a year, eager in the specific way of a man still trying to prove he belonged, came in with something he clearly considered important enough to interrupt Bumpy's evening. Heard something on the corner? Dubois is telling people you're scared of him. Says the old lion's already dead, just hasn't noticed yet. Let him say it. Boss, people are starting to believe it. Not everybody, but enough. Bumpy looked at the boy a long moment, seeing in him some rougher, younger echo of Wesley's frustration, Theo's doubt, all of it dressed in less patience because Isaac had less history to draw restraint from. Belief is cheap, he said. It changes the moment the truth shows up wearing the right coat. 1347. That night, alone in the office long after everyone else had gone home, Bumpy pulled a small tin box from the bottom drawer of his desk, the kind of box a man keeps for things too small to matter to anyone else, and too large to ever throw away. Inside, a spool of thread, half-used, 30 years old, brittle now, useless for anything but memory. He'd kept it since that night in the print shop. He turned it over in his hands the way another man might turn over a photograph, and understood, sitting there in the quiet, that the thread wasn't really the debt. The debt was the door. A stranger, closest to the trouble, choosing to open it anyway, at a cost he hadn't calculated in advance and hadn't asked to be repaid. That kind of choosing deserved more than convenience in return. 1355. He thought, too, about the sentence Cyrus had said that first week, sitting on an overturned crate with a fresh scar under his sleeve. Not touched, not used, not owed anything by you, and never owing anything to you either. At the time, it had sounded simple, the kind of promise a man makes because refusing costs more than agreeing. It had never once sounded simple since. Not the year Bumpy had first heard, secondhand, that Cyrus's youngest daughter had married a man Bumpy could have ruined with a single phone call, and hadn't. Not the years he'd walked past the print shop knowing exactly what quiet business moved through its back room after dark, and never once taxed it, never once touched it. Though every other operation on that block eventually came to owe him something. A promise kept in silence for 30 years doesn't announce its own weight. It just accumulates, patiently, the way debt always does, waiting for the one day it finally gets called. 1402 Eli Dubois, 3 miles south, sat in a back room of a club he'd taken over from a man too slow to hold on to it, listening to Ezra Pratt's report with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a plan work exactly as intended. 3 hits, bar, corner, laundromat. Not a peep out of him. Not one. Eli leaned back, turned a glass of something dark between his fingers without drinking it. My grandfather used to say the old lions don't roar anymore. They just watch the young ones circle, deciding if it's worth the energy to still be a lion. Maybe he's not deciding, Ezra said. Maybe he's already decided. Maybe he's scared. Bumpy Johnson doesn't get scared. Everybody in this city knows that. Then what's he doing? Eli didn't answer right away, some small uncertainty flickering behind eyes that usually gave nothing away for free. I don't know, he admitted, and that bothers me more than if he'd hit back already. 1411. You ever wonder, Ezra said, refilling his own glass, though nobody had offered, why your grandfather never once mentioned him? 2 men running businesses 3 miles apart for 30 years, and not a single word passed between your house and his that you ever heard. I've wondered. And I don't have an answer, which is exactly the kind of thing that used to keep my grandfather up at night too, if the stories are true. Silence that specific isn't an accident. It's a decision somebody made and kept making year after year, for reasons neither of them ever bothered writing down. Ezra shrugged, unconvinced, or unwilling to spend more time on a mystery that didn't put money in either of their pockets by morning. Old men and their secrets. Doesn't matter to us either way. He's not answering. That's the only fact that pays rent. 1418. Ezra Pratt had been with Eli since the beginning, since before there was an empire to speak of, back when it was 2 young men with more ambition than money, and a shared belief that Harlem's old guard had gotten fat and slow on decades of unchallenged comfort. He'd built half of what Eli now claimed credit for, in Ezra's own accounting of things, though nobody had ever asked him to keep that particular ledger out loud. Whatever he's doing, Ezra said, it's working against him. Every day he doesn't answer, our people get louder. Yours are starting to believe you're the future, and he's already a ghost. Let them believe it. I do. I just think we should help the belief along. Give it a push it can't ignore. Eli glanced at him, something careful crossing his face. Not yet. Ezra said nothing, but the word yet landed somewhere it wouldn't easily leave. 1426. Left alone in the office after Eli went out to handle some smaller matter downstairs, Ezra sat a long while with the week's numbers, doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with money. 3 hits, 3 months of building, and the one man whose blessing would have made the whole operation unquestionable in the eyes of the street hadn't so much as blinked. That kind of stillness didn't read, to Ezra, like fear. It read like a man who already knew something the rest of them didn't, holding a card nobody else at the table had been shown yet. He didn't like playing against cards he couldn't see. He liked even less waiting for someone else to decide when to show them. 1435. Back uptown, Wesley Cade called a meeting Bumpy hadn't authorized. 6 men in a back room above a barber shop, voices low. The particular heat of loyal men convinced their loyalty was being wasted. 3 hits, Wesley said. 3, and not a single response. You all saw what happened to Nate, kneeling in the street like a dog. Murmurs of agreement, low and dangerous, the kind that build momentum faster than any single voice could manage alone. I'm not saying we go around him, Wesley continued, though the sentence already suggested exactly that. I'm saying somebody needs to remind this boy what happens when you test a man who built half this city with his bare hands. Nobody disagreed out loud. Nobody needed to. The room had already decided something, and decisions made in rooms like that one rarely stayed contained by the men who'd made them. 1444, Isaac Bell, youngest man in the room, spoke up near the end, voice cracking slightly, with the effort of saying something to men twice his age. What if he's got a reason we don't know about? What if this isn't about weakness at all? The room went quiet a beat. Not agreement. Just the brief pause men give a new voice before deciding whether it deserves an answer. Then he can tell us the reason, Wesley said, and we'll listen. Until he does, all we've got is what we can see, and what we can see is our people kneeling on sidewalks while he signs funeral books for men who never once mattered to this operation. Nobody argued that either. Isaac didn't say anything else the rest of the meeting. 1452. Bumpy found out about the meeting the next morning, the way he found out about most things. A whisper passed through 3 mouths before it reached his own ear, softened and sharpened in equal measure by every hand it passed through. He called Wesley into the office alone. You held a meeting without me. Wesley didn't deny it. I did. Say what you have to say. Your people are losing faith in you. Not because you're weak, because you won't tell them why you're not weak, and a man can only run on trust alone for so long before trust starts asking for proof. It was, Bumpy thought, the most honest sentence anyone had said to him in weeks. I hear you, he said. I can't give you the reason yet. I can give you my word, there is one. Your words carried this operation 20 years. I'm not questioning that. I'm questioning how much longer it holds if the street stops believing it. 1505. Give me until it matters, Bumpy said. Not forever, not another 3 hits, but until it actually matters, not just until it's uncomfortable. Wesley studied him a long moment, the particular study of a man deciding whether the request in front of him was reasonable or simply the last coin of trust he had left to spend. "How will I know when it matters?" "You won't have to wonder. I promise you that much." Wesley nodded slowly, not satisfied exactly, but willing for now to carry the weight a little further, before setting it down in front of the rest of the men, waiting on him for an answer he still didn't fully have. 15:20. 2 days passed in the uneasy quiet of a city, waiting to see which way a decision would finally break. Then the fourth hit came, and this one wasn't aimed at a business or a collector or a license. It came for the one thing Bumpy had never once, in 30 years of running this city's underside, allowed anyone close enough to threaten. Adele Johnson, 19, Bumpy's daughter, was driving home from her evening class on 145th when a car pulled alongside hers at a red light, and a brick thrown by someone Wesley's men would later identify only by a description too general to be useful, came through the passenger window in an explosion of glass that left her screaming, unhurt but shaking, glass in her hair, in her lap, in the seat beside her, where a friend might have been sitting on a different night. 15:41. Bumpy got the call at 15:41 exactly, and would remember that number for the rest of his life, the way a man remembers the exact second a floor gives way beneath him. Odessa's voice, controlled but only barely. "She's fine. She's fine, Bumpy. She's not hurt. But her window, someone threw something through her window." He was already moving before she finished the sentence, coat half on, car keys already in hand. The particular speed of a man who has spent 30 years being careful, suddenly finding all that carefulness burned away in an instant. A promise about a family did not survive the moment somebody threatened his own. He understood, driving too fast down streets he knew too well, that the rules he'd been living under for 6 weeks had just changed, whether he'd chosen it or not. Some lines don't ask permission before they get crossed. They just get crossed. And a man finds out, after, what he's willing to do about it. 15:58. Adele sat in the kitchen when he arrived, a blanket around her shoulders despite the mild evening, glass still glinting faintly in strands of her hair that Odessa hadn't finished picking clean. She wasn't crying anymore. She'd moved past that into something harder, colder, an anger Bumpy recognized, because he'd worn it himself more times than he could count. "I'm fine, Daddy. I know. You don't have to look like that. I know that too." He knelt in front of her chair, took her hands, checked them for cuts, the way he'd once checked another man's arm for the depth of a wound that mattered more than either of them understood at the time. "I'm not asking if you're fine. I already know you are. I'm asking you to tell me exactly what you saw." She told him. It wasn't much. It was enough. 16:07. "A dark sedan," she said. "2 men, one driving, one who threw it. I only saw him for a second before the glass came in, young, heavy-set, had something on his jacket, a pin or a patch, I couldn't tell exactly." "Which side of the street? Which direction after?" "North. They went north fast. Didn't even slow down at the corner." Bumpy filed every word away, the way he'd filed a scarred jaw and a gold ring years before this particular war had ever started. Small things becoming, slowly, a shape he could eventually act on. "You did good," he told her. Better than most grown men manage after something like that. She almost smiled, the first almost smile the evening had offered either of them. 16:15. Wesley arrived within the hour, and this time, Bumpy didn't send him away. "Talk to me," Bumpy said, voice low, controlled, the particular control of a man holding something very large, very still by main force. "We've got a partial description. 2 men in the car. One with a build that matches somebody in Eli's crew, not Eli himself. Someone lower down. Name. Working on it. Should have something by morning." Bumpy stood, walked to the window, looked out at a street that had somehow gone on being ordinary, while his own house had just been rewritten from the inside out. "When you have the name," he said, "you bring it to me first. Not to anybody else. Not to a meeting in a back room. To me." Wesley heard something in the sentence that hadn't been there in weeks. Not permission exactly, but the shape of it, arriving. "Understood." 16:24. Theo arrived not long after Wesley left, having heard already through the same channels that carried everything in this neighborhood faster than any telephone could manage. "How is she?" "Shaken. Not hurt. Angry, mostly, which is better than the alternative." Theo nodded, understanding without needing more detail than that. "You want me to pull the men off the laundromat problem? Focus everything on this instead?" "No," Bumpy said, surprising even himself with how steady the word came out. "We handle both. The laundromat gets fixed the quiet way, tomorrow, paper against paper. This gets handled a different way entirely." "What way?" "The way I should have started 6 weeks ago, if I'd let myself." 16:33. That night, long after Adele had finally fallen asleep upstairs, and Odessa had stopped pretending she wasn't watching Bumpy for signs of what he intended to do next, he sat alone in his study with the tin box open in front of him again, the old thread coiled inside it, like something that had been waiting 30 years to matter this much. A promise about family had never been tested against his own family before. Cyrus's blood had bled to keep him safe. Bumpy's own blood, his daughter, glass in her hair, a brick meant for a face she hadn't shown yet, to a war she hadn't started, had just been offered up on the other side of the same old ledger. And no promise made in an alley 30 years ago had ever accounted for that particular arithmetic. He understood sitting there, that restraint had just become something else entirely. Not broken, not yet, but no longer patient. 16:44. He thought about calling Eli directly, one phone call, voice to voice, no intermediaries, and decided against it almost as fast as the thought arrived. A phone call gave a man too much room to lie convincingly, too much distance to hide behind. Whatever came next needed to happen close enough that Bumpy could watch a face while it answered him, the same way he'd learned, decades ago, to watch Wendell's hands instead of his words, to watch Russo's eyes instead of his denials. Faces lied easily over a telephone line. They lied much harder. Standing 3 feet away, with nowhere left to look, but at the man asking the question. 16:51. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. He thought of Eli's face at the funeral, that careful stillness, and wondered for the first time since the casket had gone into the ground, whether the boy had ordered this himself, or whether something inside his own crew had moved faster than its master's leash allowed. It didn't matter yet which was true. What mattered was that a line existed, now that hadn't existed that morning, and Bumpy Johnson intended to hold it without breaking the older, deeper line underneath it, the one drawn in an alley, sealed with a needle and thread, that no amount of broken glass would ever give him permission to cross. Silence is the interest a promise pays. Tonight, for the first time in 6 weeks, he stopped paying it quietly. 1700. He went upstairs once more before the night closed in fully, stood in the doorway of Adele's room, the way he'd once stood in the doorway of his own bedroom on a night years ago that had cost him differently. She was asleep finally, the blanket pulled up to her chin, glass long since cleaned from her hair, the particular stillness of a young woman whose body had decided, on its own, that the danger was over, even if the rest of the house hadn't caught up yet. He didn't wake her. Some promises don't need to be spoken aloud to be renewed. He made this one standing in a doorway instead of sitting on a crate, but it carried the same weight the first one had, not less, for being silent. If anything, more. 1709. He called Wesley back before midnight, voice steady. Decision finally arrived, at the way decisions arrive, after enough weight has gathered behind them. Find the men who did this. Not Eli, the men who threw it. And when we find them, we don't kill them. We don't touch a hair on them, beyond what it takes to bring them somewhere quiet. Then what? Bumpy looked out at the dark street below, Harlem's ordinary night noise rising up faintly through the glass, a radio, a car, a dog barking at nothing in particular, a city that had no idea what had just shifted inside one of its oldest, quietest men. Then I have a conversation with them, he said, that I should have started having 6 weeks ago, and Eli Dubois is going to hear about it before the sun comes up. 7:12. Morning came reluctant, gray at the edges, the particular gray of a city that hadn't decided yet whether the day would turn to rain. Bumpy hadn't slept. Not really. An hour here, an hour there, sitting up each time with the same image behind his eyes, glass in his daughter's hair, catching lamplight, like something almost pretty, which made it worse, not better. Wesley was waiting in the kitchen when he came down, coffee already poured, 2 cups, the second one a habit built over 20 years of mornings that started exactly like this one. Anything. Something. Wesley slid a folded paper across the table. Isaac worked the corner near where the sedan turned north. Found a kid who saw it park an hour later, 4 blocks over. 7:19. Description matches what Adele gave us. Heavy-set man, jacket with some kind of pin on the lapel. Wesley tapped the paper. Kid says the pin was gold, shaped like a fist. Says he's seen it before, on men who run with Dubois' crew specifically, not the whole operation, a smaller circle inside it. How much smaller? 4, 5 men, best guess. The ones closest to Eli personally, not street-level muscle, his inner ring. Bumpy turned that over slowly. If the men responsible sat inside Eli's own inner circle, this hadn't been some low-level soldier freelancing for attention. Or it had been exactly that, and the circle simply wasn't as tight as Eli believed it to be. 7:27. Names, Bumpy said. Working on it. Isaac's good, but he's careful. Doesn't want to spook the kid into silence by pushing too hard too fast. Careful's fine until it isn't. Bumpy stood, drained the coffee, though it had barely cooled enough to drink comfortably. I want a name by this afternoon. Not tomorrow. Today. You're going yourself. I'm going myself. Wesley didn't argue this time. Something in Bumpy's voice had settled overnight into a register neither of them had heard in 6 weeks, steady and certain in a way that made arguing feel almost beside the point. 7:41. Theo arrived not long after. Having already spent the early hours making calls Bumpy hadn't explicitly asked for, but wasn't surprised to learn had been made anyway. The laundromat permit's fixed. Called in a favor with a clerk who owed me since 51. Silver Suds reopens by noon. Good. That's the easy one. Theo set down a second sheet of paper. This one covered in his own cramped handwriting. The Gold Fist. I know it. Saw it once on a man who used to run numbers for the old Marchetti crew before they folded. Small crew of 5, 6 men. Eli didn't build them from nothing. He absorbed them, maybe 8 months back, when Marchetti's people scattered. Meaning he inherited men with their own loyalties already formed. Meaning exactly that. Meaning maybe not everything wearing his colors actually answers only to him. 7:53. It was a thin thread, but threads pulled long enough in the right direction eventually led somewhere solid. Bumpy had learned that lesson decades ago, in an alley at 19, and had never once forgotten it since. Find out who ran that cruise day to day, back when it was Marchetti's. If Eli inherited the muscle, he might not have inherited the loyalty underneath it. You think somebody in his own crew is working an angle he doesn't know about. I think a man that young, moving that fast, building an empire in 6 months instead of 6 years, has more moving parts than he's got hands to hold steady. I want to know which part threw that brick and whether it moved on his order or moved on its own. 8:10. Isaac came through by mid-morning, breathless in the particular way of a young man who understood he'd finally earned something worth the effort of running to deliver. Got a name. 2 names, actually. The kid remembered a second man waiting by the corner after, didn't do the throwing, just watched, like he was making sure it happened right. Names. Marcus Webb. Big guy. Matches the description exactly. Used to run with Marchetti before the crew scattered. And the one watching, that one the kid only half recognized, but he thinks it might be somebody higher up. Somebody who gives Webb his orders most days. Bumpy felt something settle into place, cold and certain. Ezra Pratt. 8:22. You know him? By reputation. Not by face, not yet. Bumpy stood, already reaching for his coat. He was at the funeral. Sat close to Eli. Closer than blood usually sits without also being blood. Theo frowned. You think Pratt ordered this, without Eli knowing? I think it's possible. And if it's possible, it changes everything about how I answer it. How's that? Because a war Eli started, I answer as a war. A war his own man started behind his back. That's a different kind of problem. And it needs a different kind of solution. 8:35. Wesley had already begun assembling men by the time Bumpy finished dressing. 4 cars total, drivers he trusted with silence as much as with speed. Men who understood that whatever came next needed precision, not spectacle. Where do we find him? Wesley asked. Webb or Pratt? Both eventually. Webb first. He's the hand that threw it, and hands talk faster than the men who point them. And if he doesn't want to talk? Bumpy checked the revolver in his coat pocket. an old habit from a life that had taught him weapons were sometimes worn more for the conversation they enabled than the one they ended. He'll want to talk. Men usually do, once they understand exactly how much quieter their options have gotten. 9:04. Marcus Webb ran a small numbers operation out of a barber shop on 8th Avenue during daylight hours. Respectable cover for a man whose real income came from favors nobody wrote down. Bumpy's men found him there just after 9, mid-conversation with a customer, entirely unaware that the morning had already decided how it was going to end for him. Wesley went in first, calm, unhurried, the particular calm that made grown men more nervous than shouting ever could. "Marcus, somebody wants a word." Webb's eyes went to the door, found Bumpy standing in it, and something in his face did the thing faces do when a debt long avoided finally arrives to collect itself. "I don't know what this is about." "You will." 9:15. They took him 3 blocks over, to an alley behind a shuttered dye factory, the kind of place chosen specifically because it offered privacy without drama. Walls close enough on both sides to remind a man, without needing to say so out loud, exactly how little room existed for anything but honesty. Bumpy studied Webb a long moment before speaking, the same way he'd studied Rousseau years ago, reading the specific shape of a man's fear to understand what kind of fear it actually was. Not innocent fear, guilty fear, the kind that already knew what question was coming and had spent the walk over here rehearsing which lie might survive it. "My daughter," Bumpy said, "was in a car on 145th Street 2 nights ago." 9:24. Webb's composure cracked almost immediately, faster than Bumpy had expected, faster than a man usually broke when he still believed silence might save him. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to God, I didn't know it was your daughter's car. Nobody told me whose car it was. Just a car. Just a message. That's all it was supposed to be." "Whose message?" Webb's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the mouth of the alley, as though checking whether the answer might somehow escape before he had to say it out loud. "Ezra's. Ezra Pratt. Not Eli. Eli didn't order it. I'd stake my life on that. He doesn't even know." "You're staking more than your life right now, Marcus. Choose your words like it." 9:33. "Pratt came to me last week," Webb said, the words tumbling faster now, the particular rush of a man who has decided that speed is the only remaining shield he has left. "Said Eli was moving too slow, too careful, that the old man," he caught himself, flinched, "that you weren't answering fast enough to prove the street had really changed hands. Said we needed something that couldn't be ignored. He said a car, a brick, a girl who could have been killed if the glass caught her wrong. He said scare somebody close to you. He picked the car. He picked the street. I just drove. And through." Webb's silence answered that better than any word could have. At 9:44. "Does Eli know," Bumpy asked, "that his own right hand ordered an attack on my family without asking him first?" "No?" Webb shook his head. Fast, certain. The first thing he'd said all morning that carried no hesitation in it at all. "Pratt told me himself. Keep it quiet. Don't tell Eli. Said Eli would want to slow down. Said sometimes you have to move a young boss forward, whether he's ready to move or not." That sentence sat in the alley a long moment, heavier than anything else Webb had offered. a lieutenant, deciding on his own that his boss's restraint was a liability to be corrected. Quietly, without permission. Bumpy understood that particular arithmetic better than most men alive. 9:56. "You're going to do something for me," Bumpy said, crouching now to Webb's eye level, voice dropping into the register he reserved for moments that mattered more than threats usually needed to. "Anything. You're going to go back to your corner, and your barber shop, and your numbers, and you're going to live exactly the ordinary life you were living before Pratt handed you a brick and a bad idea. You're not going to warn him, I know. You're not going to run. You're going to wait, and when I call on you again, you're going to answer. Because right now, the only reason you're walking out of this alley is that I need you more useful, alive, than I'd get satisfaction from you otherwise." Webb nodded, fast, grateful in the particular way of a man who has just been handed a mercy he knows he didn't earn. 10:12. Back in the car, Wesley drove in silence for several blocks before finally speaking. "Pratt. Not Eli." "Not Eli," Bumpy confirmed, "which changes the shape of this more than I want to admit." "How so?" "Because if I go after Eli now, I'm answering a crime he didn't order, punishing a man for a sin his own lieutenant committed behind his back. That's not justice. That's just a different kind of mistake. So what do we do with Pratt?" Bumpy looked out the window, watching Harlem slide past in its ordinary indifferent rhythm. A city that had no idea how close it had just come to a war built on a lieutenant's impatience rather than a boss's actual intention. "We don't touch Pratt yet either. Not directly. We do something slower." 10:26. "Slower how?" Wesley pressed, clearly frustrated by an answer that still didn't resemble the response he'd been asking for since the funeral. "We take apart what Pratt's actually built underneath Eli, the suppliers, the corners, the money, piece by piece, quiet enough that nobody can trace a single move back to a single order. We make Eli's whole operation weaker without ever raising a hand against either of them directly. That's not vengeance. That's accounting. Accounting's a kind of vengeance if you're patient enough to let the math finish itself." Bumpy allowed himself something close to a thin, humorless smile. "Cheap coffee? Expensive ink? Pratt wanted to prove Eli needed pushing. I'm going to prove exactly how much that pushing costs. Both of them." 10:41. They spent the rest of the morning building the shape of it. Theo pulling old contacts among liquor suppliers to quietly redirect the terms Eli's crew had used to undercut the palm room. Wesley working channels inside the same bureaucracy that had pulled the laundromat's permit, learning which other favors that same clerk might owe elsewhere. Favors that could just as easily unravel as accumulate. Isaac was sent to watch, not act. Corners, deliveries, faces, building a map of exactly how Eli's operation actually moved money, where its weak joints sat, which suppliers worked for loyalty, and which worked only for whoever paid on time. By noon, 3 separate threads existed that hadn't existed that morning. Each one small, each one quiet, each one capable of costing Eli Dubois more than any single act of violence ever could. 11:15. Across town, Eli sat across from Ezra in the same back office, going over numbers that had started, in the last week, to look slightly wrong in ways he couldn't yet name. The liquor supplier for the Palm Room's asking for renegotiated terms, Eli said, frowning at a ledger page. Same supplier who offered us the undercut in the first place. Why would they suddenly want more money from us than they're asking Johnson's people? Suppliers change their minds. Market shifts. Markets don't shift this fast without a reason. Eli looked up. You hear anything about this? Nothing, Ezra said, too quickly, the particular quickness of a man who had, in fact, heard something and chosen not to mention it. 11:28. And the permit situation, Eli continued, flipping to another page. Word is, Johnson's laundromat reopened by noon yesterday, fixed just as fast as it broke. That favor cost us 3 weeks of leverage for 1 day of inconvenience on his end. He's got clerks in his pocket everywhere. You knew that going in. I knew it in theory. I didn't expect it to unwind this clean, this fast. Eli set the ledger down, studied Ezra a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. Almost like somebody warned him exactly which levers we were about to pull. You think somebody's talking? I think something's not adding up the way it should. 11:40. Ezra held his expression carefully still, the particular stillness of a man managing a room he'd spent considerable effort building, and now found, unexpectedly, harder to control than he'd planned for. Maybe Johnson's just better than either of us gave him credit for, he offered. Old lion, sure. Doesn't mean the claws went dull. Maybe. Eli didn't sound convinced. I want eyes on every deal we've got running. If something's leaking, I want to know before it costs us more than a supplier's patience. I'll handle it. You've been handling a lot lately, Eli said, something new entering his voice. Not quite suspicion yet, but the early, uncomfortable cousin of it. More than I remember asking you to handle some weeks. 12:03. The afternoon brought the second front of Bumpy's quiet campaign into motion, a series of small, deniable moves that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. The particular arithmetic of a man who understood that a structure built fast on borrowed loyalty could be unmade the same way, one loose brick at a time. Theo's contact at the liquor distributor demanded new terms by end of week. Wesley's clerk discovered 2 more permits, unrelated to Eli directly, but tied to businesses he'd absorbed from Marchetti's old operation, that suddenly required review. And a rumor, planted carefully through 3 mouths that would never trace back to its source, began moving through the same corners Eli's men worked, that the boy building an empire on another man's old muscle hadn't actually earned any of it himself. 12:19. Isaac reported back near evening, having spent the day watching one specific corner, where 2 of Eli's men handled a steady flow of product, moving through what had once been Marchetti territory. They're nervous, he said. Not about us specifically, about each other. I heard one of them say something about Pratt taking too much credit for work other men actually did. Cracks, Bumpy said, mostly to himself. Sir? An operation built fast on inherited loyalty has cracks in it that a slower-built one wouldn't have. We're not causing anything new. We're just making sure the cracks that already existed get a little wider, a little faster. 12:33. Wesley found Bumpy in the office that evening, the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent the day doing exactly the kind of work he understood, rather than the kind of waiting he hadn't. This is the plan, then. Death by paperwork. Death by paperwork and patience, and letting a young man's own impatience finish the job for us. Bumpy looked up from a stack of reports Theo had assembled through the afternoon. Pratt wanted to prove Eli needed pushing. Every day this goes on, Eli's going to start wondering exactly what Pratt's pushing has actually cost him. And when Eli figures out it was Pratt who threw the brick, that's the part I can't control. That's the part that decides whether this ends quiet or ends loud. 12:47. You still haven't told me why, Wesley said, careful, the question he'd been holding since the funeral, finally finding its way fully into the room. Why the restraint? Why not just handle Eli the way you'd have handled anybody else 6 weeks ago, before any of this started? Bumpy considered him a long moment, weighing again how much of an old debt a man like Wesley could carry without needing its full shape explained. His grandfather saved my life once, a long time ago. I made him a promise that his family would never be touched by whatever I became. Wesley absorbed that in silence, something in his face shifting. 20 years of frustration reorganizing itself around a fact that finally made sense of everything that had come before it. That's why the bar, the corner, the permit. That's why all of it. 13:02. And the girl in the car, Wesley said, quieter now. You're Adele. That's not covered by any promise, is it? No, Bumpy said. That's the one thing the promise never accounted for. A debt to a dead man's family weighed against my own. I don't have a clean answer for that arithmetic. I only have the answer I've already given. I don't kill Eli, because the promise still holds. But I don't sit still either. Not anymore. Not after glass in my daughter's hair. So we take his empire instead of his life. We take exactly enough of it that he understands, without ever needing to be told directly, that some lines cost more to cross than any amount of ambition is worth. 13:20. 3 days passed in the particular quiet of a campaign, working exactly as intended, suppliers wavering, permits reviewed, small rumors doing the patient work that violence never managed as cleanly. Eli grew visibly tighter each day, the easy confidence of the funeral gradually replaced by something more watchful, more suspicious. A young man increasingly aware that his empire had begun leaking from seams he couldn't immediately locate. Ezra, for his part, grew louder in exactly the wrong direction, pushing harder for a decisive strike precisely as the ground beneath his own credibility had begun, without his full understanding of why, to soften. We need to hit him again, Ezra said on the 4th evening. Harder this time, something he can't quietly absorb. Or we need to find out why everything we've built the last 2 months is suddenly coming apart at the joints, Eli answered, an edge in his voice that hadn't been there a week earlier. 13:44. The confrontation, when it came, arrived not from Bumpy's side, but from Eli's own growing unease. The particular unease of a man who had begun, quietly, running his own numbers on a suspicion he didn't yet want to name out loud. The car that hit Johnson's daughter's window, Eli said, watching Ezra's face carefully as he said it. Marcus Webb's build matches the description going around. You know Webb better than I do. You brought him in from Marchetti's old crew personally. Ezra's expression held steady, but something in the room's air had changed. The particular change that happens When a lie finally starts running out of road. Lot of heavy-set men in this city, Eli. Sure, but not many of them work for me. 1402. Eli let the silence sit a long moment, watching, the way Bumpy might have watched, the way patience learned from 30 years of surviving a dangerous city, eventually teaches a man to watch. "Tell me you didn't order that," he said finally. "Tell me straight, and I'll believe you, because I've trusted you since before either of us had anything worth trusting each other over." Ezra's jaw worked once, twice, the calculation visible even through the effort to hide it. "I was trying to move things forward," he said finally. "You were being too careful. I thought a push. You hit his daughter's car, without telling me, without asking me. I was protecting what we're building. You put a target on a 19-year-old girl to protect a business plan." 1419. The rage that crossed Eli's face then wasn't performed, wasn't calculated the way so much of his careful public composure usually was. It was raw, immediate, the specific fury of a man discovering that someone he'd trusted with everything had gambled with something he would never have agreed to risk. "Get out," Eli said, voice low. Dangerous in a register Ezra had apparently never heard from him before, judging by the way his own composure finally cracked. "Eli, listen. Get out of this office. We'll talk about what happens next when I've decided I can be in a room with you without deciding something I can't take back." Ezra left without another word, and Eli sat alone a long while after, understanding for the first time exactly how much of his empire had been built on assumptions he'd never actually verified. 1440. Word of the falling out reached Bumpy by the next morning, carried, as most things eventually were, through channels too tangled to trace back to any single source. "They're not speaking," Isaac reported. "Pratt hasn't been back to the office in 2 days. Word on the corner is Eli found out about the brick." Bumpy allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, something close to quiet satisfaction. "Good. Good? He's still out there, boss. Still running half a district. This doesn't fix anything, does it?" "It doesn't fix everything," Bumpy said. "But a boy who's just learned his most trusted man lied to him and endangered a stranger's family without permission is a boy who's about to start asking different questions than the ones he's been asking so far." 1458. Wesley wasn't as convinced. A wounded animal's more dangerous than a confident one, not less. If Eli's embarrassed, angry, feeling like he's lost control of his own crew, he might come back harder just to prove he's still the one in charge. He might, Bumpy agreed. That's the risk. But an operation split against itself doesn't hit as hard or as smart as one moving together. We keep pressing the business. We let the crack between them do what a crack does when enough weight sits on it. And if he comes for you directly, not the business, you. Bumpy considered that a long moment, the particular weight of a possibility he'd been quietly holding since the night the brick came through Adele's window. "Then we'll be ready for that too." 1520. Ezra Pratt, meanwhile, spent those same 2 days in a state Bumpy would have recognized instantly. The particular unraveling of a man watching everything he'd built come apart faster than he could reasonably explain it, even to himself. He drank more than usual. He made calls to men he'd have been embarrassed to call a month earlier, testing whether loyalty still existed anywhere in the structure he'd helped assemble, and finding, with each call, less of it than he'd expected. By the third night, sitting alone in a bar 3 blocks from the office he could no longer walk into, he understood something he hadn't let himself understand before. That Eli's caution, the caution he'd spent weeks pushing against, had actually been the only thing holding the whole fragile structure together. 1538. He also understood, with the particular clarity that comes only to a man who has run out of other options, that there was exactly one way left to salvage his position, find something, anything, that could tip the balance back in his favor, before Eli finished deciding what to do with him permanently. He started asking questions about Bumpy Johnson himself, the kind of questions men usually didn't bother asking about an opponent they'd already decided was simply old and slow. Why hadn't Johnson retaliated harder, faster in the early weeks? Why had a man with 30 years of ruthless reputation absorbed 3 hits without so much as raising his voice? Somewhere in that question, Ezra suspected, sat an answer worth more than anything he'd built so far. 1602. It was an old bartender, a man who'd worked the same corner for 40 years and remembered more than most people credited him for, who finally gave Ezra the thread he was looking for, over a drink Ezra paid for, specifically to loosen a memory he suspected existed. Dubois, the bartender said, when Ezra mentioned the name carefully, testing. Old Cyrus? Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken in this bar in years. Quiet man. Ran that print shop like it was a church. Heard once, long time back, that Johnson himself used to owe him something. Never did learn what. Ezra sat very still. Owed him what kind of something? The bartender shrugged, already losing interest, moving on to another regular further down the bar. Don't know. Some kind of promise, way I heard it. The old kind. The kind men used to actually keep. 1624. Ezra left the bar with something he hadn't had 2 hours earlier. Not proof, not yet. Just the outline of a shape that explained, better than anything else had, exactly why a man like Bumpy Johnson had spent 6 weeks absorbing hits he could have answered in a single night. A promise. Made to Cyrus Dubois decades ago, the kind of debt that didn't show up on any ledger a man like Ezra knew how to read, but existed anyway, binding, apparently, even now, even after the man who'd been owed it had already gone into the ground. If that was true, Ezra understood. It meant Johnson's restraint had never been fear at all. It meant something far more dangerous to a man in Ezra's position. A weakness, with a name, a shape, a specific price that could, perhaps, still be paid. 1641. He didn't go to Eli with it. Not yet. Going to Eli now, after everything, would only confirm exactly how much digging he'd been doing behind his boss's back a second time. And Ezra understood, with the particular clarity of a desperate man, that a second betrayal discovered this soon after the first would end whatever chance remained of repairing things. Instead, he began quietly working to confirm it himself. Old records, old neighbors, anyone who might remember exactly what young Bumpy Johnson had once needed badly enough from an old printer to owe him a debt that apparently outlived the man himself by 6 weeks and counting. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. Ezra didn't understand yet how expensive his own understanding was about to become. 1703. Back at Bumpy's office, the pressure campaign entered its second week, with results even Wesley couldn't entirely dismiss. 2 of Eli's smaller operations, absorbed originally from Marchetti's scattered crew, quietly folded under the weight of permits that no longer cleared and suppliers who'd found better terms elsewhere. The Palm Room's liquor delivery returned to its original supplier, chastened, apologetic, offering better rates than before out of what Theo dryly called a newfound appreciation for long-term relationships. And on the street, the rumor Bumpy had planted, that Eli's empire rested on borrowed muscle and a lieutenant's overreach, had grown legs of its own, repeated now by men who'd never even met either Pratt or Bumpy directly. 1721. "He's losing ground," Isaac reported, unable to keep a certain satisfaction out of his own voice now, after weeks of doubting the plan entirely. Not fast, not dramatic, but losing it, corner by corner, the way water finds every crack in a wall eventually. "That's the idea," Bumpy said. "When does it end?" "When he understands, without me ever having to say it to his face, that whatever he thought he was building against me, he was actually building against something a great deal older and a great deal more patient than he accounted for." Isaac considered that. "And Pratt? Pratt's going to keep unraveling on his own. Desperate men usually finish the job of their own destruction faster than anyone else could manage it for them." 1740. That evening a message arrived at Bumpy's office that changed the shape of everything that had come before it. Not from Eli, not from Ezra, but from an unexpected third party. The old woman from the funeral, the one in the gray coat, who'd remembered Cyrus's half-finished sentence about a young man who might become something to thank or curse. She'd asked, through a mutual acquaintance, to see him directly. Said she had something that had belonged to Cyrus, something she'd been holding on to since his death, unsure who else might want it or deserve it. Bumpy went himself that same night, understanding somehow, before he even arrived, that whatever waited for him would matter more than another week of permits and suppliers. 1815, her name was Ruth Alden, a widow in her 70s, who'd rented the apartment above Cyrus's print shop for the last 15 years of his life, close enough to have become, in her own quiet way, one of the few people who'd actually known the man behind the ink-stained apron. "He gave me this to keep, years back," she said, producing a small, worn leather folder from a drawer in her kitchen. "Said if anything ever happened to him, and a certain man came asking questions eventually, I should give it to him. Never told me your name outright. Just described you close enough I knew it the moment I saw you at the service." Inside the folder, a single sheet of paper, in Cyrus's own careful, aging hand, dated only 3 years earlier. 1829. The letter was short. "Bumpy, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And probably you've already spent some weeks wondering whether the promise still holds, now that I'm not around to remind you of it. It does. I never doubted you'd keep it. Not once in 30 years. And that's not a small thing to say about a man in your position. But I have a grandson, Eli. I haven't been the grandfather to him I should have been, too proud, too stubborn, too aware of what he was becoming, to sit comfortably in the same room with it. If it ever comes to a place between the two of you, tell him about the alley. Tell him what he needs, not what's easy. He deserves the truth more than he deserves my silence. 1844. Bumpy read it twice. Standing in Ruth Alden's small kitchen, the particular understanding always comes late, feeling sharper now than it had in weeks. Cyrus had known, even 3 years ago, that his grandson's ambition might someday collide with the debt owed to protect him. He'd known, and instead of extracting a firmer promise or warning Eli directly, he'd left instead a simple, almost gentle instruction. Tell him the truth when the moment demanded it, rather than let silence do the only work it had ever done between the two families. "Did he say anything else?" Bumpy asked. "About Eli. About what he expected." Ruth shook her head slowly. "Just that. Said the rest would sort itself out, the way these things usually do, given enough patience." 1902. Bumpy drove home slower than usual that night, the letter folded carefully in his coat pocket, sitting there, the way the old thread had sat in its tin box for 30 years. Small, quiet, disproportionately heavy for its size. He thought about the timing of everything, the 6 weeks of restraint, the campaign now quietly dismantling Eli's empire brick by brick, the fracture already growing between Eli and Ezra, without Bumpy needing to lift a hand toward either of them directly. And he thought, too, about the next inevitable step, the one Cyrus's letter had all but ordered him toward: a conversation, eventually, face-to-face, where Eli finally learned exactly why the old lion he'd spent months testing had never once, despite every provocation, actually roared back. 1924. He found Odessa still awake when he got home, a book open on her lap that she hadn't been reading, waiting the particular way she'd learned to wait over 20 years of marriage to a man who carried more than he ever said out loud. "You look different tonight," she said. "I found something. From Cyrus. A letter he left, in case things ever got complicated with his grandson." "What did it say?" Bumpy sat down across from her, and for the first time in 6 weeks, told her the whole shape of it. The alley, the needle, the promise, the 6 weeks of quiet restraint, the growing crack between Eli and Ezra, the letter now folded in his coat. Odessa listened without interrupting. The particular listening of a woman who understood that some stories needed to be told all the way through before anyone was allowed to respond to them. 1951. "You're going to tell him," she said finally. "Eli, about the promise. Eventually, when it matters more than my own comfort about saying it. It already matters, Bumpy. His man put a brick through our daughter's window. Whatever restraint you've been showing, he doesn't know the reason for it. And a man who doesn't understand why his enemy hasn't struck back yet is a man who eventually stops waiting to find out." It was, Bumpy thought, almost exactly what Cyrus's letter had said, in different words, from a different mouth, arriving at the same conclusion by a different road entirely. 2010, 3 streets away, in an apartment considerably less comfortable than Bumpy's own, Ezra Pratt sat with a stack of old newspaper clippings he'd spent 2 days gathering, piecing together a version of the story that was close to true without being entirely accurate. A young Bumpy Johnson once connected somehow to the Dubois family, once bound by an obligation nobody currently living fully understood the shape of. It was enough, Ezra decided, studying the clippings by lamplight. Not the whole truth, but enough of a shape to use. If Johnson wouldn't fight back because of some old debt to Eli's dead grandfather, then the debt itself was a weapon. One Ezra intended to be the first to actually pick up and swing, whatever it cost him with Eli afterward. 2028. He drafted carefully, over the next hour, an anonymous message meant to reach Eli through a channel that wouldn't trace back to him directly. Not the whole truth, just enough of a suggestion to reopen a door Eli had slammed shut 3 days earlier. Ask your grandfather's old neighbors about Bumpy Johnson. Ask why an old print shop kept running quiet business for 30 years without ever once being taxed by the most powerful man in Harlem. There's a reason he hasn't hit you back the way you deserved. Find it, and you'll understand exactly how much leverage you're sitting on without knowing it. He sent it before he could talk himself out of it, understanding, even as he did, that he was gambling everything he had left on a stranger's old secret actually being real. 2047. Eli received the message the next morning, unsigned, delivered by a boy who claimed not to know who'd paid him to carry it, and read it 3 times before setting it down on his desk with the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the last 2 months of his life. An old debt. A reason for restraint that had nothing to do with fear. He thought immediately of the letter he'd found, weeks earlier, going through his grandfather's effects after the funeral. A letter he hadn't fully understood at the time, addressed to no one, unfinished, mentioning a young man saved once in an alley and a promise extracted in return. He'd assumed it was nothing. An old man's private business, unfinished, irrelevant. He no longer assumed that. 2105. He pulled the letter from the drawer where he'd filed it, unread past the first paragraph weeks earlier, and read it now in full, slowly, the particular slowness of a man understanding, sentence by sentence, that the war he'd spent 2 months building had been fought, from the very beginning, against an opponent who could have ended it in a single night, and had chosen every single time not to. Not out of weakness, out of a promise kept to a dead man Eli had barely known himself. Something in his chest shifted, reading it, an emotion he didn't immediately have a name for. Not gratitude exactly, not shame exactly. Something closer to the specific vertigo of discovering the ground beneath an entire worldview had never been quite what it appeared to be. 2124. He sat with the letter a long while, the office quiet around him, Ezra's absence somehow louder in the silence than his presence had ever been. He thought about the brick through a stranger's window, his own crew, kneeling a soft-spoken collector on a sidewalk in front of a barber shop full of witnesses. Months of pushing against a man who could have crushed him in a week and instead had absorbed every hit with something Eli now understood. For the first time, hadn't been weakness at all. It had been the most expensive kind of mercy, the kind a man extends not because it costs him nothing, but precisely because it costs him everything, and he pays it anyway. 2147. He didn't call Ezra. He didn't call anyone. Instead, He sat at his desk long after the office had emptied, the letter in front of him, and began, for the first time in 2 months, to genuinely consider what kind of man he actually wanted to be remembered as. The boy who'd built an empire fast on borrowed muscle and inherited grievance, or something closer to the grandfather he'd barely known, a man who'd apparently understood, better than Eli currently did, that some debts mattered more than any amount of territory ever could. Understanding always comes late. That's why it's expensive. Eli was beginning, finally, to understand exactly how expensive his own understanding was about to become. 22:10. The next morning brought a message to Bumpy's office that neither of them had anticipated arriving quite this way. Not from Ezra, not through rumor or intermediary, but a direct request, delivered by a boy on a bicycle in the particular manner reserved for matters too delicate to trust to a telephone line. "Mr. Johnson, I'd like to meet. Alone. No crew, no witnesses beyond whoever you need for your own safety. I think we've both been fighting a war neither of us fully understood the shape of." E. Dubois Bumpy read it twice, the same careful attention he'd given Cyrus's letter 3 nights earlier, and felt, for the first time since the funeral, something that might eventually resolve into an ending neither violent nor entirely bloodless, but honest at least, in a way the last 2 months had conspicuously failed to be. 22:31. "You're going," Wesley said, more statement than question, watching Bumpy fold the note and set it in his coat pocket, alongside the letter from Ruth Alden's kitchen. "I'm going." "Alone?" "Close enough to alone that it means something. You'll be near, but not visible. If this is genuine, showing up with an army defeats the entire point of what he's asking for. And if it's not genuine, if Pratt's behind this too, some kind of trap dressed up as a peace offering..." Bumpy considered that, weighing Ezra's growing desperation against the particular tone of Eli's note. Careful, direct, nothing in it that read like a man setting a snare rather than finally asking an honest question. "Then we'll find out. But I don't think it's a trap. I think it's a boy who just found out something about his own grandfather that changed how he sees everything else." 22:52. "Where?" Wesley asked. Bumpy thought about it a long moment, understanding somehow exactly where this needed to happen, if it needed to happen at all. 131st Street, the old print shop. That building's been empty for years. That's exactly why it needs to be there. Some conversations only mean what they're supposed to mean if they happen in the room where the original debt was made. Wesley nodded slowly, some final piece of the last 2 months finally settling into place for him too. "Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow, sundown. And Wesley, whatever this turns into, I need it handled quiet. This isn't a war anymore, whatever it started as. It's a debt, finally coming due, between the only 2 people left who actually understand its full weight." 6:18. Ezra Pratt woke before dawn with the particular clarity of a man who has run out of moves and understands it. The anonymous letter he'd sent Eli 2 days earlier having produced nothing but silence, and silence in Ezra's current position, read less like patience and more like a verdict already reached. He'd gambled the last of his standing on a stranger's old secret, and the gamble had bought him nothing. No summons back to the office, no forgiveness, not even the satisfaction of an argument. just quiet. The same quiet that had swallowed 3 of his own operations over the past 2 weeks, corner by corner, supplier by supplier, an unraveling he still didn't fully understand the mechanics of. 6:31. He made calls that morning to the 4 men who remained genuinely his, not Eli's, not inherited from Marchetti's old crew, but his own, recruited personally, loyal in the specific way men become loyal to whoever pays them first and explains themselves least. 1 more push, he told them, gathered in the back room of a pool hall on 7th that had quietly become his headquarters since Eli's office stopped being available to him. We hit Johnson's people directly this time, not property, not permits, something that reminds the street who's actually still standing. Eli know about this, one of them asked, careful, the particular carefulness of men who'd already watched one boss's certainty crack in front of them recently. Eli's not thinking clearly right now. I am. That's why I'm the one still talking. 6:47. The target Ezra chose was Theo Marsh, not for any personal grievance, but because Theo's fingerprints sat visibly on the permit reversals and supplier renegotiations that had cost Ezra's operation the most over the past 2 weeks. And hitting the architect of that unraveling felt, to a desperate man, like the fastest way to make it stop. The plan was simple, crude, the kind of plan a man builds when strategy has already failed him and only speed remains. Intercept Theo's car on his morning route to the office, force it off the road in a narrow stretch near the rail yards, deliver a message with fists instead of bricks this time, close enough to Sirius that nobody could mistake it for another warning shot. 4 men, 2 cars, a route Theo had driven predictably enough for years that predicting it required no particular skill at all. 7:52. What Ezra didn't know, because he had no way of knowing it, was that Isaac Bell had spent the better part of the previous week doing exactly what Bumpy had asked of him, watching, mapping, building a picture of Eli's fracturing operation from the outside, and had, 3 days earlier, picked up a thread leading directly to the pool hall on 7th, where Ezra's remaining loyalists now gathered before dawn. Isaac had reported it immediately, and Wesley, methodical as ever, had quietly put a man on the pool hall's door in shifts ever since, waiting to see what Ezra's desperation might eventually produce. It produced that morning 4 men climbing into 2 cars a full hour before Theo Marsh typically left for the office, moving with the particular urgency of men executing a plan rather than simply going about their day. 7:58. Wesley's man followed at a careful distance, radioed ahead the moment the 2 cars turned toward the rail yards instead of toward downtown, and Wesley, already dressed, already moving, reached Bumpy's office before 8 with the news delivered flat and fast. Pratt's making a move. 4 men, 2 cars, headed for the rail yard stretch on Theo's morning route. Bumpy was already reaching for his coat before Wesley finished the sentence. Get Theo off that road. Now. Radio him directly. Don't wait for him to reach the yard. Already done. He's rerouting. Wesley checked his watch. We've got maybe 20 minutes before Pratt's men realize the target isn't coming. 8:11. 20 minutes, Bumpy understood, driving fast toward the rail yards with Wesley beside him, and 2 more cars following close behind, was exactly enough time to turn a desperate man's failed ambush into something Bumpy could actually use. Ezra had spent 2 weeks trying to prove that Eli needed pushing, that patience was weakness, that speed and violence still mattered more than whatever quiet campaign Bumpy had been running against him. Now, stranded on an empty stretch of road with a target that wasn't coming, and no plan for what came next, Ezra was about to learn exactly how much that philosophy actually cost a man, once somebody more patient decided the lesson needed finishing. 8:19. The rail yard stretch ran narrow between 2 long brick warehouses, a corridor with only 2 real ways in or out, chosen by Ezra's men for exactly the qualities that now made it a trap instead of an ambush point. No side streets, no easy retreat, nowhere for a car to go that didn't run straight past whoever controlled both ends of the road. Bumpy's cars arrived from the north end first, blocking it entirely. 3 vehicles angled across the width of the street, with the particular precision of men who had done this kind of work before, and understood exactly how much space a car actually needed to feel trapped rather than merely inconvenienced. Wesley's second team came from the south, moments later, closing the corridor completely. Ezra's 2 cars now sitting stationary in the middle of a road that had just stopped being a road at all and become, instead, a box. 8:24. Ezra's men understood what had happened almost instantly, the particular understanding that arrives in a man's body before his mind fully catches up to it. Doors thrown open, hands reaching for weapons that would do them no good against 4 cars and a dozen men already stepping out with their own drawn and steady. "Hands where I can see them," Wesley called out, voice carrying flat and hard down the empty corridor. "All of you, now." One man hesitated a half-second too long, reaching still toward his coat, and Bumpy's own voice cut through before anything worse could happen. "Don't. You've got exactly 1 chance to walk away from this morning breathing. Don't spend it proving a point nobody's going to remember you for." 8:31. The hesitation broke. Hands went up. One by one, on Wesley's flat, patient instruction, all 4 men knelt in the road, palms visible, the particular posture of men who had woken up that morning, believing themselves the ones delivering a message, and now found themselves instead receiving one considerably harder than the one they'd planned. Bumpy walked the length of the corridor slowly, studying each face, until he reached the man closest to the front, older than the others, the particular bearing of someone who'd been given the plan rather than simply following orders blind. "Pratt send you himself, or is he watching from somewhere safer?" "He's not here," the man said, voice tight. "Said he had somewhere else to be this morning." 8:39. Of course he did. Bumpy crouched to the man's eye level, the same posture he'd used with Marcus Webb weeks earlier, the particular stillness that made kneeling men more afraid than shouting ever managed to. "Here's what happens now. You're going to stand up, get back in your cars, and drive to wherever Ezra Pratt is currently hiding from the consequences of his own planning. And you're going to tell him something for me." "What's that?" "Tell him the man he's been trying to provoke into a war isn't fighting a war against Eli Dubois. Never was. Tell him whatever war he thinks he's still running exists entirely inside his own head now, because everyone who used to answer to him just watched 4 cars box him in without firing a single shot. That's not fear he's facing. That's a verdict." 8:47. The men were released, disarmed but unharmed, sent back down the corridor with their message and their humiliation both intact. The particular kind of consequence Bumpy had learned decades ago carried further than a bullet ever could. Men who walked away, shaken talked, and talk moved faster through Harlem than any single act of violence managed to on its own. Wesley watched them go, something like satisfaction finally settling into his shoulders after weeks of frustrated restraint. That's the loudest thing we've done since this started. It needed to be loud, Bumpy said. Pratt needed to hear clearly that whatever leverage he thought he still had just ran out completely. Everything after this is cleanup. And Eli? Eli's about to find out exactly what his own man's desperation almost cost him. That's a conversation I think he's ready for now. 9:15. By mid-morning, word of the rail yard confrontation had already begun moving through Harlem, in the particular way news like that always moved, exaggerated in some tellings, understated in others, but consistent in its core fact. Bumpy Johnson's people had trapped 4 of Ezra Pratt's men in a box with a dozen guns, and let every one of them walk away, breathing. A mercy more unsettling to the street than violence would have been. Precisely because it demonstrated a control violence never quite managed to prove on its own. Ezra heard it within the hour, from a man too rattled to soften the telling, and understood, sitting alone in the back room of the pool hall that had briefly served as his headquarters, that whatever remained of his position had just finished collapsing entirely. 9:34. He didn't run. Running would have confirmed everything the morning had already made obvious. Instead, he did the only thing left available to a man who had gambled everything and lost. He went to find Eli directly, not to plead exactly, but to finish on his own terms, a conversation that circumstance had already decided the outcome of days earlier. He found him at the club, alone in the back office. The letter from Ruth Alden's kitchen, the one Cyrus had written, the one Bumpy had shared with Eli 2 nights earlier, when the 2 men had finally spoken by telephone, brief, careful, agreeing only to meet properly the following evening, sitting open on the desk in front of him. 9:41. You sent men after Theo Marsh this morning, Eli said, not looking up. Without telling me, after everything that already happened with the girl's window. I was trying to fix what I broke. You broke it by not telling me the truth the first time. You just tried to fix it the same way, by doing something enormous behind my back and hoping it worked out before I found out. Ezra had no answer for that, standing in the doorway of an office he'd helped build and no longer had any real claim to. I know about Johnson's promise, Eli continued. The old debt. Your letter told me what you'd learned, even if you didn't sign it. 9:53. Then you understand, Ezra said, something almost desperate entering his voice now, that we've had leverage this whole time, and I was the only one willing to actually use it. You've been sitting on a weapon and refusing to fire it out of some sentimental attachment to a grandfather you barely knew. That weapon, Eli said, finally looking up, is the reason my grandfather's family survived 30 years in a city that eats families like ours for breakfast. You didn't find leverage, Ezra. You found the one thing standing between us and a war we'd have lost eventually, no matter how it started, and you tried to weaponize it against the man honoring it. I was protecting what we built. You were protecting your own position. Don't dress it up as anything else in front of me. 10:08. Ezra left the office without another word, understanding, finally, that whatever remained of his future in Harlem had just been decided by a morning he hadn't even personally witnessed. 4 men on their knees in a rail yard corridor, and a boss who no longer trusted a single word out of his mouth. He would leave the city within the month, not exiled formally, not marked for anything worse than irrelevance, but understanding, the way men in his position eventually always understood, that a reputation built on manipulation collapsed entirely the moment its target learned to see through it. Some men get a second chance to rebuild trust. Ezra Pratt, by the particular arithmetic of the world he'd chosen to operate in, had spent his on a brick, through a stranger's window and a failed ambush in a rail yard. And there was no third attempt coming after that. 10:34 Bumpy learned of Ezra's departure from the club by early afternoon, delivered by Isaac with the particular satisfaction of a young man who'd spent the last 2 months watching a plan he'd initially doubted play out exactly as its architect had promised. "He's done," Isaac said. "Eli cut him loose this morning. Word is, he's already looking at trains south." "Good. You don't sound surprised." "I'm not. A man who builds his position on lies eventually runs out of people willing to keep believing them. Pratt just ran out faster than most, because the lie he told cost somebody's daughter a night of broken glass instead of just money." Isaac nodded slowly. "So it's over? The war?" "The war's over. What's left now is a conversation. That's a different thing entirely, and it matters more than anything the last 2 months accomplished." 1800. The old print shop on 131st sat exactly as it had for years. Windows painted over from the inside. The faded Dubois printing sign missing its D entirely now. Weather having finished the job, neglect had started. Bumpy arrived first, alone as promised. Wesley and 2 others positioned discreetly enough down the block that their presence wouldn't be obvious to anyone not specifically looking for it. He let himself in through the side door, the same door he understood standing in front of it, that Cyrus had once opened onto an alley to save a 19-year-old boy who had no way of knowing, that night, exactly how long the debt from that choice would end up outliving both of them. 1807. Inside, the shop smelled of dust and old paper, decades of disuse settling over shelves that had once held type blocks and stacked bulletins. The press itself still sitting in the corner where it had always sat, silent now, rusted, a machine that had printed more secrets after dark than church announcements during the day. Bumpy found the back room easily, the room where a needle and thread had once closed a wound that had nothing to do with the man receiving it, and everything to do with the man who'd chosen to bleed rather than watch a stranger die in an alley he could have simply walked past. He was still standing there, in the particular quiet of a room holding 30 years of memory, when Eli arrived, precisely at sundown, alone, exactly as agreed. 1815. "This is where it happened," Eli said. Not a question. Standing in the doorway with the same careful stillness Bumpy had noticed at the funeral, though something in it had changed since then. Less calculation now, more genuine uncertainty. The particular uncertainty of a young man about to learn something that would rearrange everything he thought he understood about his own family. "This is where it happened." Eli stepped inside, looked around the room slowly. The workbench, still bolted to the wall, the shelf where the tin box had once sat, the particular light through a single dusty window that hadn't changed in 3 decades, even as everything else about the building had. "Tell me," he said. "All of it. Not the version in the letter. The whole thing, the way it actually happened." 1824. So Bumpy told him. The alley, the 3 men, the knife already comfortable in a stranger's hand. The side door opening, the revolver, the warning shot, the blade that had found Cyrus's arm instead of Bumpy's throat, because an old man had chosen, without hesitation, to stand between a 19-year-old he'd never met and a death that wasn't his own to prevent. The needle, the thread. Hands shaking through every stitch while Cyrus talked him through it. Steady, unbothered. The particular steadiness of a man who understood pain well enough to know it didn't require an audience's fear to survive it. And finally, the promise, sworn on an overturned crate in this exact room, 30 years before a brick found its way through a 19-year-old girl's car window, on a street neither man that night could have imagined existing yet. 1841. Eli listened without interrupting, the particular listening of someone finally hearing a story he'd spent his whole life circling, without ever quite reaching its center. "He never told me any of this," he said, when Bumpy finished. "Not once. I grew up thinking he was just a printer, a quiet old man who ran a shop and kept to himself. I never knew he'd saved anyone's life. I never knew he'd bled for a stranger and asked for nothing but a promise in return. He wasn't a man who talked about what he'd done, only about what needed doing next." "Sounds like someone I've been trying too hard not to become," Eli said, quiet. Something in his voice that hadn't been there at the funeral, hadn't been there in any of the 6 weeks of escalation that followed it. 1853. "I have to ask you something," Eli said after a long moment. "And I need the honest answer, whatever it costs either of us to hear it. If Ezra hadn't hit your daughter's car, if none of that had happened, how long would you have let me keep testing you? How far would you have let me go before the promise stopped mattering more than everything I was taking from you?" Bumpy considered the question carefully, understanding it deserved more than a comfortable answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'd like to believe there was a line I'd never have let you cross, promise or not. But I hadn't found it yet when the brick came through her window. That's the truth, whether it's the answer you wanted or not." 1904. "And now," Eli said, "the businesses, the suppliers, the permits, everything I've watched fall apart over the last 2 weeks. That was you too. That was me too. Not violence, just dismantling, piece by piece. A war built fast on borrowed loyalty comes apart the same way it was built, if somebody patient enough decides to pull on the right threads." Bumpy studied him. "I didn't do it to destroy you. I did it because a boy testing an old man's restraint needed to understand eventually that restraint isn't the same thing as inability. I could have ended this the first week, Eli. Every version of ending it I could have chosen would have cost you considerably more than a few suppliers and a permit review." 1918. Eli absorbed that in silence, walking slowly around the small back room, running a hand along the workbench the way Bumpy himself had run a hand along the storefront glass weeks earlier. Both men, in their own separate moments, reaching for a connection to a man who'd shaped both their lives without either of them fully understanding it until now. "What happens now?" he asked, finally.
"Between us? I've spent 2 months trying to prove I could take territory from you. I don't actually want that anymore. I'm not sure I ever really did. I think I wanted to prove I could be something other than my grandfather's quiet legacy, and I picked the wrong way to prove it. What do you want instead?" 1931. "I don't know yet," Eli admitted, and there was something almost like relief in the admission. The particular relief of a young man setting down an ambition that had never quite fit the shape of who he actually was.
"I know I don't want what Ezra wanted. I watched what that cost him this morning, watched 4 of my own men come back shaking, talking about guns and kneeling in a rail yard. And I understood finally that whatever I was building, it was starting to look like exactly the kind of operation my grandfather spent his whole life quietly refusing to become part of."
"He kept a legitimate print shop running for 40 years, Bumpy said, while doing quieter, more dangerous work in the back room after dark. He understood something a lot of men in this life never learn, that the loudest power isn't always the most lasting kind."
1947. "Teach me that," Eli said, the request arriving with a directness that surprised even him, judging by the way he said it. "Not the territory, not the businesses I tried to take, the other thing. Whatever it is that let a man run this city's underside for 30 years and still have men like you standing in a room, honoring a promise made to him decades after he could no longer collect on it himself."
Bumpy studied the younger man a long moment, seeing for the first time since the funeral something other than Cyrus's jaw and a stranger's ambition, seeing instead the beginning of a man who might actually grow into someone worth the debt that had protected him from a violence he'd never even known was being withheld. "That's not a lesson I can teach in one evening," he said.
"But it's one I'm willing to start teaching, if you're serious about learning it."
2003. "What about the businesses?" Eli asked. "The ones I've lost these past 2 weeks. Are they gone for good?"
"Some of them.
The ones you took by undercutting me unfairly. I'm not giving back. You'll have to rebuild those honestly if you want them at all. But I'll stop the rest of it tonight. The permits, the suppliers still wavering, all of it. Not as a gift, as a starting point for something neither of us has actually had before, an understanding instead of a war."
Eli nodded slowly, something in his posture finally settling. The particular settling of a young man who had spent 2 months carrying a weight he now understood he'd never actually needed to carry at all.
2019. They stood together a while longer in the small back room, neither man in a particular hurry to leave a space that had, in the span of one conversation, transformed from a monument to an old debt into something closer to a foundation for whatever came next. "He would have wanted this," Eli said, finally, looking around the room one more time. "Wouldn't he? Not the war. This. The 2 of us, standing here, finally understanding each other, instead of just circling. I think he would have wanted exactly this," Bumpy said. "It's why he wrote the letter in the first place. He knew, even 3 years before he died, that someday the debt might need to become something more than silence between two families who'd never properly spoken. 2034. "What happens to Ezra?" Eli asked as they finally moved toward the door together. "He's already leaving the city. That's his own doing, not mine. A man who builds his position on other people's trust eventually finds there's nothing left standing once the trust runs out." Bumpy paused at the threshold, looking back once at the room where a promise had been made 3 decades earlier, by two people who could never have predicted this particular evening waiting at the end of it. "Let him go."
Chasing him further wouldn't teach either of us anything the last 2 months haven't already taught plenty. 2051. Outside, the evening had settled fully into night. Streetlights flickering on, up and down 131st the way they always had, indifferent to whatever quiet history had just finished rearranging itself inside a shuttered storefront that most of Harlem walked past daily without a second glance. Eli extended his hand, the same gesture he'd offered at the funeral, though something in it now carried actual weight instead of calculation. "Thank you," he said, "for the truth and for the promise, even though I spent 2 months trying to break something it was protecting." Bumpy shook his hand, firm, final, the particular finality of a debt not erased, but finally properly understood by both parties who'd carried its weight. "Your grandfather saved my life once in this exact spot. Consider tonight the promise still holding 30 years and one very difficult war later." 2115. Wesley met him at the corner once Eli had gone, driving off alone into a Harlem night that had, for the first time in 6 weeks, stopped feeling like a countdown toward something violent and started feeling instead like an ordinary evening in an ordinary city that had no idea how close it had come to losing something it never knew it had. "Well?" Wesley asked. "It's over." Just like that. Not just like that. 6 weeks of restraint, a boy's grandfather's letter, a lieutenant's desperate mistake, and one honest conversation in a room that's been waiting 30 years for it. That's not just like that. That's exactly as long as it needed to take. Wesley started the car, pulling away from the old print shop, its faded sign disappearing into the dark behind them. "You think he'll keep his word? Build honest instead of borrowed." 2128. "I think he's got a better chance now than he did 2 months ago," Bumpy said. "A man who's just learned the truth about where his own restraint should have come from doesn't unlearn that easily. Whether he actually becomes it, that's still his choice to make, same as it's always been anybody's choice, mine included. 30 years ago, in an alley with a knife 3 feet from my throat." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the particular silence of 2 men who'd spent 6 weeks carrying a weight that had finally, properly, been set down. 2152. At home, Bumpy found Odessa waiting the way she always waited, and Adele sitting with her, both of them looking up when he came through the door with the particular attentiveness of a household that had spent 6 weeks holding its breath without quite admitting it out loud. "It's done," he said, simply, and watched something visibly loosen in both their shoulders at once. "The Dubois boy," Odessa said. "You talked to him." "We talked. It's over. Really over. Not just quiet for now." Adele stood, crossed the room, hugged him the way she hadn't since she was considerably younger than 19. the particular hug of someone finally allowed to stop being careful about a danger she'd understood, even without every detail, had been circling closer to their family than anyone had said out loud. 22:14. Later, alone in his study, Bumpy opened the tin box one final time, the old thread still coiled inside it. 30 years brittle now, useless for anything but memory. He set Cyrus's letter beside it, the two objects together telling a fuller story than either could have told alone. A debt made with a needle in an alley, and a debt finally honored with words in the same room decades later. He didn't close the box right away. He sat a long while instead, thinking about doors, the one Cyrus had opened without hesitation, on a night that cost him blood and asked for nothing but a promise, and the one Eli had walked through that evening, ready, finally, to understand exactly what that promise had actually meant all along. 22:41. Understanding always comes late, that's why it's expensive. But some understanding, arriving even after every other version of it had already cost what it was going to cost, still mattered, still changed what came next, still turned a war that could have ended in blood into something closer to an inheritance, passed down finally, properly, from one generation of a debt to the next. He closed the tin box, set it back in its drawer, and turned off the lamp. Outside, Harlem carried on the way it always carried on, indifferent to the quiet ending of a war most of its residents had never fully understood was being fought at all. A promise kept, a debt honored, and two men, old and young, finally standing on the same side of a line 30 years in the making.